Okay, YouTube, I'm not going to blame my Viking ancestry for my animalistic urges to kick ass and take names.
Radio Free Innsmouth, episode 341, talking about some Viking metal this week, but not black metal, which is usually the genre most associated with the Viking stuff nowadays. No, we're talking about Viking Death Metal. If you're one of these death clock watching, more poser adjacent types, you think of Viking Death Metal, you think of Amon Amarth.
My Viking ancestry.
Don't worry, I still kind of like their first album and a couple other songs. If you're a little more on the actual death metal maniac side of things, you probably think of Unleashed, who I covered at the beginning of this year back on episode 309. And if you're a true grim and frostbitten, gore-soaked death metal psychopath...
Say that again, just like in one quick sentence.
All the fucking
A quick sentence.
You might even think of the first album from Dominus that I covered more than, good lord, I don't even know, 5 years ago, back on episode 20. But we're not talking about any of those more well-known bands this week. Instead, we got two more obscure but still very high-quality and unique-sounding Viking-themed death metal bands, whose death metal corpus consists, in both cases, of one full-length album and one follow-up EP that are both very much worth your time. The first of which is Hazael from Poland, who are somewhat infamous in the death metal underground for being the least Polish-sounding Polish extreme metal band of the 90s. Now, usually when people say a band sounds Polish, if they're talking about black metal, they mean it sounds like Graveland. If they talk about death metal, they mean it sounds like Vader. Perhaps needlessly reductive, but at least in the case of the 90s stuff, more often than not, generally pretty true. Hazael don't sound like either of those at all. In fact, if you were to hear them without knowing that they were Polish, you'd probably just think they were Swedish. They described themselves as playing a new genre of music called frost death metal.
It's cold. My nipples are like pencil erasers.
Which in the context of their debut full-length album ends up sounding like this. Generally longer song runtimes with an emphasis on the demonstrative and majestic. They do a lot of unexpected weird stuff, like what you're hearing right now where they introduce the song's central leitmotif via clean female vocals, before then really exploding on that same riff with a much more savage brand of percussive yet melodic death metal. There's also a major emphasis on texture, like here where they play the same riff with a couple different drum beats under it. And they kind of do an Abigor style thing, where there's a lot of full stops between different chunks of music that are sectioned off into their own little worlds. However, unlike with Abigor, these sections are not indicative of major compositional divergences, but rather, each section is very much in communion with the simpler musical skeletal structure established by the song's main intro. Like this blasting riff right here very much follows up on the song's intro riff. Here comes another really good example of them messing around with texture, because they're still playing the same riff just in a completely different style now, with this more wandering echoed kind of feel. A major distinguishing factor for this album compared to other death metal releases at the time, particularly in Poland, is its emphasis on very consonantly melodic and narrative elegiac lead guitar. Very Swedish sounding. Speaking of which, we got another one of those more melancholic sections. The combo of that and the more involved lead guitar actually reminds me a whole lot of Gorement. And if you've seen episode 274 of the show, you know that's a good thing coming from me. Also some stuff from Dismember and Hypocrisy, of course. This is kind of a cool little lead-out riff, still preserving the general melodic soul of that more echoey part, but now with harsher vocals and more aggressive double bass under it. It's pretty sick sounding shit, and this album's actually still somewhat easily available due to a 2014 reissue put out by Dark Descent Records. Last I checked, they still had copies of it for sale on their website. So if you want to hear more stuff that sounds like this, they got a CD out there, got 10 songs of that shit. Fittingly enough for a Viking death metal band, a lot of the riffs on this album sound like death metal reinterpretations of Viking-era Bathory riffs, or maybe even a little bit of the old Manowar stuff. Mid-paced and heavy with an emphasis on consonant melody emerging from behind very percussive impacts that slides very nicely into the more atmospheric sounding sections, again somewhat redolent of Gorement. And then those real big solos hit as a nexus of emotional climax. The rhythm guitar riff going on behind this one is almost indistinguishable from many similar riffs that happened on Bathory's Hammer Hearts album. And the slower section which follows feels almost orchestrated, like the rhythm guitars are a different section of music climbing up to occasionally touch concepts that the lead guitar is commenting on. It might not be as technically complex or as focused on brutality and speed as other Polish death metal albums of the time were, but they're not necessarily shooting for that either. They're doing their own very cool style.
Very cool.
Very cool. Very cool.
And I would recommend picking up that Hazael album up if you're into stuff like Gorement or the slower Dismember songs or even Edge of Sanity. The second band we're going to be covering this week is Asgard from France, who are perhaps even more obscure than Hazael, if that's at all possible. I guarantee I never would have come across these guys if not for Brett Stevens, because he did a review of them on the old Dark Legions archive about 1 billion years ago, and it's listed right in between Arcturus and Osfix, who were two of my favorite bands in high school, so you know I had to read that shit back then. So as much as I goof on that guy, he can't be all that bad if he likes Asgard. Because Asgard are in fact pretty sick, and they deserved a lot more attention than they got when they were around. Like Hazael, they play Viking-themed death metal, but in a much different style, both compared to Hazael and compared to, honestly, almost any other death metal band running around at the same time. Because 1996 is to a golden age, has some real unique shit going on, stylistically and in terms of their songwriting. As you're hearing right now, they're way more likely to use very audible bass lines and clean guitar than your other typical death metal bands from the time period might be inclined to use. But that doesn't make the music lighter in tone at all. In fact, this shit gets really fucking brutal and savage in an almost ramshackle war metal adjacent way at times. Like this heavier, faster bit we're building up to right here. More than anything, it kind of reminds me of some kind of weird blend of Order from Chaos and early Cataclysm. Then we get into the more percussive riffs, which this band also excels at. Check out this part coming up here with the natural harmonics. Fucking savage shit. It's got a real bounce to it, but not in a fun-loving way at all. Much more brutal and mean sounding, which is fitting because this song's called Crusade of the Berserker. And more than anything else, it feels like getting hit in the head with a throwing axe. This fucking groove section right here is so sick. Dave Lombardo style ride cymbal thing going on here. And then it leads into something even stranger, because when this song finally does let up in intensity, it goes into this melancholic, melodic, keyboard-inflected thing that actually gives off a lot of Hellenic black metal vibes to my ears. Like real early Passage to Arturo era Rotting Christ. I guarantee if this album came out like this year on Nuclear War Now Records, people would be going fucking nuts for it. The Viking thing is more than just kind of a coating on the exterior of the music too. They really sink into that atmosphere to the point where, you know how early Enslaved had that really expansive narrative, Edvard Grieg inflected sense of atmospheres and shifting sound textures? These guys do that same sort of thing, but in a more impact-heavy death metal way. The longest song on the album, A Day in Valhalla, starts out with these slow, doomy, but not necessarily gloomy kind of riffs, developing a single continuous melody over very cleanly done bass lines. It's much more soundscapey than death metal usually gets, and in that way it is kind of black metal-ish. And it gradually transitions to a more dark and brooding tone for when the faster death metal shit finally gets there. And again, it's kind of Cataclysm sounding with how fast it is, and the alternating vocals, the conspicuous melodies. But then just as quickly it goes back into more soundscapey territory. This time there's only clean guitars, much lighter than average drum work, and that all-important bass guitar. I guess that's another thing they have in common with early Enslaved. And then eventually at the end of all that, we revisit that doomier style from the beginning of the song, but now there definitely is a real sense of darkness and evil to everything. But they are a death metal band, so they gotta go fast again eventually. Otherwise you're gonna have the Mortician contingent being like... Asgard's To a Golden Age, one of the undersung classics of the death metal dark ages of the mid to late 90s. This one actually did get reissued back in 2015 by Transcending Records. I believe it's sold out now, but you could probably find it on Discogs. I mean, obviously, I bought it off their Bandcamp when it was released.
Say that again, just like in one quick sentence.
all the fucking poo.
Earlier on, I mentioned that the death metal work of both of these bands consisted of a sole full-length album and an EP. And in both cases, the post-album EPs are a lot harder to find, but they're also both really fucking interesting. Hazael's post-album EP, 1996 is When the Sun is Dead, has become a recent favorite of mine because it reminds me of two things that I really enjoy. The first of which is a bit more obvious, because when this album grooves, it reminds me a lot of the best of one of my favorite more recent bands, Hooded Menace, specifically when they get into that mid-paced grooving style like... You know how these normal types got those signs up, live, laugh, fart, in this house we believe, Call of Duty is the best FPS, Cannibal Corpse is the best death metal band, Weezer's actually pretty heavy, dude, also we have sex with guys. My sign just says, in this house we believe, Hooded Menace is fucking sick, bro. So when I hear something from like 1996, way before Hooded Menace, that reminds me of the stuff I like about Hooded Menace, you know I'm gonna be a fan of that. And yeah, when this album starts really grooving hard, it sounds like fucking Hooded Menace, which means that I like it! I don't know, man, it just triggers something in my brain. Some deep-seated caveman era shit. Puts me in a good mood. When those vocals hit, they're not quite as abrasive as they were on their full-length album, which might turn some people off. But I don't hate them. It's definitely more of like a singing growl in line with what you might hear from a band like Scum, or later Gorement, maybe even Furball. Anyways, they're not a deal breaker, and this fucking transition riff right here goes hard as fuck. Fucking love this. It's definitely simpler material compared to what they were doing on the full-length album, but it's a pretty dope new style. And it gets damn heavy, as you're hearing right now, when we get into the doomier parts of the music. Again, apart from the vocals, I'm getting a Hooded Menace vibe.
Get your hand off my penis!
Occasionally it does lean a little too hard into mid-90s stereotypes, like when it does this. Like, yeah, that's a little cringy and kind of product of its time-ish. But overall, the grooving songs on this demo, EP album, whatever the fuck it is, fantastic. That's right, I did mention that this album reminded me of two things I enjoyed a whole lot. The second of those is maybe a little bit harder to pick up on, but it comes out really well during the more melodic sounding material. On that first Hazael album, the lead guitar was a major highlight. It continues to be that for this release, but in this case, it's even more thoroughly incorporated into the overall structure of every song, getting almost to amorphous Tales from the Thousand Lakes level of lead guitar morphing into rhythm guitar. That very Hammerheart era of Bathory style of riffing also makes a return on this release. In this case, it's just a bit more groove oriented, almost kind of bordering on more old school styles of heavy metal. Here comes back that lead guitar very much being a part of the song's overall structure and not just there for ornamentation in any sense. This chorus section is showing off more of those vocals again, kind of a weird style, but it grows on you, much in the way that later Sentence did for me. Then that lead guitar opens up. This is where I say it gets kind of Tales from the Thousand Lakes-ish, because this lead guitar is just going all over the fucking place, weaving around those super heavy, just rhythm guitar riffs. So fucking sick. And here's where we get into the second thing that this album reminds me of, because we're talking about a marriage of melody and really heavy groove with kind of a hard rock feeling to it and a little bit of prog rock in there maybe, with exceptionally well done melodic lead guitar. What does that make you think of?
어플로 주문을 하던가?
Damn right. Purgatory Afterglow era Edge of Sanity. You know, that type shit. Gorment's 1995 promo tape, Phlebotomized second album, Scum's second and third albums, most of the Furball Bet catalog, fucking God Gory. It's just this weird little micro style of death metal that I fucking love, you know, and I hate to turn this show into Death and Roll Matters with your boy Jub, but I fucking love this shit. It's great. And it's all over Hazael's When the Sun is Dead EP. Apparently Century Media thought the same thing that I did, because they signed these guys right after hearing this demo. Then they recorded a second full-length album. It wasn't death metal like in any way, shape, or form. It kind of sounded like Tiamat mixed with Typo Negative or something, which is like fine, but I wanted more of that heavy death and roll shit. So Century Media actually gave Hazael back the master tapes and said, hey, go sell this shit someplace else because we don't want it. And that pretty much ended the band, which is sad because I really could have used the full length in the style of When the Sun is Dead. Apparently there's like an unreleased 12-song version of When the Sun is Dead floating around out there somewhere. Somebody needs to get on reissuing that the same way Dark Descent reissued their Thor album, because that kind of sounds like it'd be the coolest fucking thing ever. Asgard, getting back to the Frenchies, also put out an EP after their full-length album entitled Shaman, and much like their full-length album To a Golden Age, it's pretty out there shit. It's not as abrupt of a shift as the jump between the two Hazael releases was, but I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that earlier Asgard stuff was already so strange and hard to pin down stylistically. Bass break. The opening track, as you hear it right now, has this real kind of rolling tribal quality to the drums that I find to be pretty interesting. They also bring back that utilization of natural harmonics from the first song on their first LP in a really cool, aggressive sort of way. As with their first release, you could definitely really hear the bass, and it does some crazy shit, like this bit right here. Like, bro, what the fuck was that? It was awesome, but I don't even know how to describe it. Definitely weird shit, but eventually it irons itself down into more standard sounding melodies. Again, kind of giving off a Cataclysm vibe to me. I don't know if it's just because they both have some French blood in their veins. And then into some more stately sounding, groove-oriented, melodic death metal kind of riffs. Definitely a potent statement of intent for a first song, before it eventually goes back into more of that weird kind of rolling tribal, I don't know what the fuck kind of death metal stuff. It's super fucking neat though. And again, even as brutal as it all sounds, it's very soundscapey. And they really take that idea of creating enslaved style soundscapes, but in a death metal context, to the next level with this release. Especially when you get to the song Trance. Very much smoking the same stuff that Disharmonic Orchestra and Atrocity were smoking, with that furious mashup of cleaner gothic stuff and brutal death metal. Also, you got some more of those awesome natural harmonics. Those are all over this release, doing some real fucking weird riffage. Again, a lot of it has that bouncy, but not really fun-loving or silly quality that was all over a lot of the percussive riffage on their first album. Also, this part right here, really cool kind of breakdown style riff into a differently textured version of itself with that faster drum beat under it, and then it collapses in spectacular fashion into the real fucking weirdo soundscape shit, with a heavy emphasis on melodic bass guitar playing underneath these odd drones. Death metal version of Proggy Enslaved in full effect. Distorted guitar comes back in, grinding out these simplistic, doomy, atmospheric, ambient kind of riffs around which the bass kind of wraps itself, providing a little bit of melodic back and forth between the two different instruments. As the cymbals do all this like weird shuffling shit, a little bit of harmonized guitar signals that we're going to be shifting again right now. This shit almost sounds like Rudra or something. Definitely befitting of the song title of Trance. You know, I'm sure you could make death metal that's more brutal or more technically complex, or maybe even uses weirder melodies than this, but I prefer something that has a really unique style. And that's what Asgard was all about doing. It's also what Hazael was all about doing. And it's why I think the two full lengths and the two EPs we covered on this episode are pretty standout examples of the really cool shit you can do with death metal. And when it comes to Viking death metal, I definitely prefer it to Amon Amarth, and honestly, even to a lot of the later Unleashed stuff. Hopefully you agree with me, but even if you didn't, thanks for listening or watching or whatever you did, and I hope to see you next time. Goodbye!
You all work together to friend me. I hate you. I wish I had guns. I wish I had fucking guns.